Hi, and welcome to Your Yard's Place in the Ecosystem. This is the first in a series of webinars from Mid-America Regional Council and Deep Roots KC with generous funding support from the Health Forward Foundation. My name is Sarah Beyer. I am a Kansas City-based native landscape consultant with Oak and IO, and I'm so pleased to be here today to talk a little bit about sort of the foundation of what makes our ecosystems work and how we can start thinking about our yards as a part of that system and how to support it and make it healthier. So really excited to have you with us. There is additional information on both Mid-America Regional Council and Deep Roots websites that accompanies this session. So make sure you get a chance to check that out. And without further ado, we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you for being here. Okay, just a quick overview of topics before we begin today. We'll first talk about ecology and define some terms to give us a shared vocabulary as a foundation for this session. Next, we'll talk about natural versus human-dominated systems and how to move from one to the other. Finally, we'll talk about our yards and what we can do to support healthy ecological systems within our space. As a quick note, I want to acknowledge that not everyone watching may have their own yard, but may be interested in a professional capacity as a landscaper helping clients, or maybe you're helping out a friend or a family member. Basically today, when I say our yards or your yard, I just mean any outdoor space where you can influence some of the decisions that are being made. We'll even cover a few tips for renters at the end of the program. Our goal today is to understand the role our outdoor spaces need to play so we can begin seeing them as a place to support overall ecosystem health. So we'll begin with a few definitions. First, ecology is the branch of science that examines the relationships organisms have to each other and to their environment. So within this definition, we've got a few words that may be new. Organism is any living biological thing. This may be an animal, a plant, bacteria, etc. But it's just one individual. Just that one little bee there is one organism. The environment is the total of all the surroundings, including living, other organisms, and non-living things that affect an organism's ability to survive. So this may be others of the same type of organism. They may be predator or prey organisms, maybe plants for food or shelter. This also includes things like the temperature, the humidity, the seasons, minerals in the soil, and more. So a group of organisms interacting with their environment is an ecosystem. And we can think about ecosystems on several different scales. So starting at the sort of large size, we have planet Earth. The name for this global ecosystem that includes all the living and non-living components is called the biosphere. If we zoom in, it could be a prairie. So the living plants, the insects, and the animals all interacting with each other and with the non-living components of the soil, the sunlight, the air, and the water. As a side note, of all of the ecosystems, all the different types of ecosystems found on Earth, grasslands are the most threatened, even more so than the tropical rainforest. But the least protected type of ecosystem. So we are losing our grasslands at an incredibly fast rate. And it is something that we need to be aware of and to try to reverse that trend. We could go even a little bit smaller and look at a pond. So you have living plants and animals interacting with each other and with the non-living components in and around the pond. Even a single scoop of healthy soil contains an entire ecosystem. You have living bacteria, you have beneficial fungus, you have microscopic organisms, all interacting with each other and with their environment. And we'll dive even deeper into this type of ecosystem in our next webinar, which will focus on soil health. So let's look at some of the ways to visualize some of the relationships within an ecosystem. We can look at these relationships as a food web. You may have heard this concept explained before, maybe called a food web, maybe called a food chain rather than a web. A food chain is part of a food web. It's just rather than showing all of these relationships, a food chain shows a simplified version of just one path through this web. So within the food web, the arrows point to the direction that energy is flowing. The organism at the point of the arrow is consuming the energy from the organism at the other end. Each role in a food web is called a niche. So a niche is the organism's job within the food web. So if we have an empty niche, a job that isn't being done, let's say, for example, we lose the caterpillars in this food web. Maybe some well-meaning person saw holes in the leaves and decided to spray the plants with some sort of pesticide. So if we lose the caterpillars, we lose the things that ate the caterpillars, and we lose everything that ate them as well. So then our food web starts to look pretty empty. For another example, if there aren't enough plants, or if the plants are something that our plant eaters aren't able to eat, and we'll talk more about why that might be in just a few minutes here. So we lose the plant eaters that directly rely on the plants. We lose the things that ate those organisms all the way up to our top predators. Another way to look at this is to think about trophic levels. The word trophic just refers to, means related to eating. So at the bottom here, we have producers. A producer is any organism that can make its own food. So these are the plants using sunlight and minerals from the soil to make energy, which is stored in the tissues of the plant. All of the higher levels above the producers are filled with consumers. So these are organisms that need to eat other organisms. They cannot make their own food. The first level is referred to as primary consumers. Primary consumers eat producers. They get their nutrition only from the tissues of plants. These are vegetarians or herbivores. And the rest of the layers eat producers or other consumers or both. So why is it a triangle? Why are there so many plants on the bottom and so few predators at the top? The transfer of energy in the system from one level to another is really inefficient. So if a plant produces, say, 100 calories of energy, the caterpillar that eats it doesn't get to keep all those 100 calories within its body. Most of them are burned up as it goes about its activities. Only about 10 calories of the plant's energy, about 10% of what it got from eating the plant, is retained within the caterpillar to feed, say, the lizard that eats the caterpillar. And then similarly, the lizard only is going to retain one of those 10 calories to feed the fox that eats it. And so on up the levels. It takes so many plants to support a healthy network of consumers. So if we don't have enough plants, or again, if the plants are not the kind that are edible to those primary consumers, then the pyramid becomes much smaller. So think about this image as contrasted with the one before. Next time you see a natural area become a subdivision, and you start to begin to see why our yards are so important. Another way to think about relationships with an ecosystem is the concept of keystone species. A keystone species is one on which others in the ecosystem depend so greatly that the removal would drastically change the ecosystem. It's important to recognize that the loss of any species affects others and disrupts the balance of a system. But usually a keystone species is one that has an importance that is proportionally much bigger than the number of individuals in the ecosystem. So just 3 examples here. The wolves, this has been studied in Yellowstone National Park in particular. They are a keystone species. So wolves keep the populations of plant eaters in check. When the numbers of wolves are reduced or even eliminated, the number of plant eaters, so the deer, the elk, and the moose that the wolves had preyed upon, become more numerous. And when the number of grazing animals goes up, they need to eat more. So this causes a reduction in their food plants, which is not only bad for the herd of grazing animals, but also for everything else that relies on plants. So as we've seen in our previous graphs, everything relies on plants. So the removal of wolves affects more than just the wolves, more than just the things that the wolves used to eat. It affects everything. Similarly, pollinators serve a keystone role, and their numbers, as you may know, are declining worldwide. The loss of pollinators has a devastating effect on plants that rely on pollination, and therefore everything else that relies on those plants suffers as well. And our third example, oak trees are a really important keystone species as well. Native oak trees feed a great number and diversity of insects and caterpillars, more than any other type of tree, and therefore feed many other organisms that eat those insects. So songbirds are other native mammals, The loss of oak trees is so much more than a loss just for the caterpillar that used to eat the oak tree. It's a loss for everything that ate the caterpillars and everything that eats those critters as well. So looking at how some of these specialized relationships developed is the process of coevolution. So evolution is the process by which living organisms gradually change over time. If you have a group of organisms, in each generation, there's going to be a variety of individuals. Not every individual is exactly alike. Some of them may be better able to survive. So if prey becomes scarce, and they may have slightly better eyesight to find food, or they may have slightly better hearing to hear threats. By surviving longer with those slight advantages, they're likely going to produce more offspring. They're likely going to pass those traits along, so their offspring are more likely to also have better hearing or eyesight. And very, very slowly, over hundreds of generations, the species changes. So coevolution is the process of evolutionary change that happens between species as they interact with each other. So this happens not just with pairs of species, but with groups of different species all interacting in the same ecosystem. We're going to take an example of just two. So we're going to look at our beloved monarch butterfly, that's the caterpillar there on the right, and its food plant, milkweed. So we have two populations of organisms here, the plants and the butterflies as they're laying their eggs looking for somewhere for their caterpillars to eat. Plants that are being eaten by something will benefit if they can develop defenses to avoid being eaten. They'll produce more leaves, they'll produce more flowers, more seeds, and more offspring. The caterpillars eating the plants will benefit if they can successfully overcome plants' defenses. They'll consume more calories, grow to be stronger and healthier adults. They may mate more successfully. They may live longer and produce more offspring. So these competing pressures are what drives the co-evolutionary process. Remember that this is all happening very, very slowly over thousands and thousands of generations. And the three examples that we're going to be talking about here are all happening at the same time. It's not a stair-step process of first one, then the next, then the next. So the milkweed has developed hair on its leaves. That makes it difficult for insects to eat the leaves. This started with one or a few individual plants that had slightly fuzzier leaves and were more successful as a result. The monarch caterpillar is able to sort of shave off those hairs and be able to still eat the leaves. Again, this started with one or a few individuals that were slightly better able to feed on the increasingly hairy milkweed leaves. Milkweed has sticky sap inside. It sort of gums up the mouth parts of insects that try to eat it. Again, the monarch population is under pressure to produce more individuals that can still eat the plant and has successfully done so. Yet another defense, the milkweed contains toxins that most animals can't eat, can't metabolize. The monarch is not only unaffected, but it actually is able to retain that toxicity and use it for their own protection against predators. So the results of these processes happening in concert, these two species have developed a really specialized relationships. Most critters cannot eat milkweed, but monarchs and other milkweed eating species are so well adapted to the challenges of eating milkweed that many of them cannot eat other plants. They are completely dependent on the milkweed species. So these types of co-evolved relationships are really important to the native plant gardener, and they exist in many different forms. When the relationship is that of an organism that eats a specific type of plant, we say that this plant is its host plant. It also exists in pollinators and other relationships between critters and plants as well. So looking at host plants, human perceptions of host plant relationships can lead to problems in the garden if we don't understand what's going on. So sometimes we think of gardens as places for plants to be pretty, and we've done a lot of work to grow these plants and we don't want them to be harmed. So it is a shift in thinking, but a necessary one, to recognize that if your plants have holes in the leaves, then they're doing their job. They are serving their niche. They are providing the base of the food web. And so we should not only tolerate holes in our plants, but encourage it. And we'll talk more about how to do that in our last section. Next, we'll quickly discuss the differences between natural and human dominated systems. So this graphic shows a natural dominated system on the left. Maybe this is a prairie. On the right is a human dominated system. Maybe this is an agricultural field, or maybe it's a turf grass lawn. So at the top, the blue line indicates a high degree of diversity on the left and a low degree of diversity on the right. In the prairie, diversity is high. We have many different leaf shapes that provide different kinds of shelter and habitat. There are many different heights of plants that allow varying amounts of sunlight to get through. Below ground, we have many different shapes of the root systems. They all occupy different places and depths of the soil, kind of fitting in together, holding it in place. There's a high diversity of microscopic organisms that live in the soil that are supporting and supported by the many different types of plants. In the lawn on the right, diversity is low. All the plants are the same, all the leaf shapes are the same, all the roots are the same. There are fewer microorganisms to support the plants. And so what we see in heavily dominated systems is increased erosion because of the singular type of root shape there. We see decreased soil health, and we'll talk more about that next time and why that is. We see increased need for additions to help keep the plants healthy in poor soil. So you have to add fertilizers and similar things, all of which cost time, cost money. And then we have a decreased diversity of food webs that can be supported. So if you think back to our previous graph, the food webs, the trophic pyramid is larger and more diverse if the plants at the bottom are more diverse and in greater numbers. So the goal is to think about how you can move your practices farther to that left side, to think about nature as your guide as you're making decisions for your outdoor space. So bringing it on home, your garden's role. The image here looks more like the right side of that last slide. So this is clearly a very human dominated space. And that's part of the shift that we want to think about. How do we invite the natural processes in and support the local ecosystem in our yards? So part of this shift is thinking about the garden as not being simply the plants, that the garden is an ecosystem. It represents a critical niche in the food web. It is the base level of our trophic pyramid. And we need to provide plants that can serve these functions. So that means providing plants that are native, that support those specialized relationships we've been talking about. Native plants are those that existed in your area prior to colonization and co-evolved with our birds, our butterflies, and our bees. So all of our native species rely on those native plants. So next, what do I do with all of this information? So the first thing we want to do is plant native plants. So as we've talked about, we need to support many different kinds of specialized relationships for the greatest diversity possible in the garden. So how do I know what's native to me? For those local to the Kansas City area, the Deep Roots website at deeproots.org is a great place to start. For those farther afield, you can look up your state's Native Plant Society or Wild Ones chapter as a place to start. I encourage you to check out the links that accompany this webinar. There's lots more resources in there for finding native plants that are local to you. And we'll also talk about this in our future webinars as we talk about the process of selecting and designing with native plants. Throughout this process, I encourage you to seek out nurseries that only sell native plants for the biggest selection, and you'll find the most knowledgeable people there. So if you're in Kansas City, these are your local friendly folks here. Before you shop, it's important to learn to distinguish between true native species and cultivars, or what's sometimes called nativars. A cultivar is a plant that has been specifically grown for a specific trait. So maybe a color of flower, a height of the plant, special blooms. So for an example, let's take this purple coneflower. The Latin name is Echinacea purpurea. And this is one of the most highly cultivated plants in the world. You'll find cultivars with many different colors, all kinds of different features. But when you look at them, the true native will say Echinacea purpurea on the plant tag. A cultivar will have some other name in a single quotation mark after it. So that name's the cultivar name, whether it be lemon drop or fireworks or something along those lines. The reason I recommend avoiding cultivars is that they may disrupt some of those co-evolved relationships. They may have less nutritious nectar, or they may have so many petals like the ones in the images here that the nectar or the pollen isn't accessible to the butterflies and bees that need to get to it. Their leaves may be less nutritious for caterpillars. We want to err on the side of providing the most beneficial plants. So to do that, I recommend that you seek out the true native species, which will be easiest to find from nurseries that specialize in native plants. Next thing we want to do is plant a variety of plants. So we want to include many different native plants in the garden that mimics our nature-dominated systems, that supports a wider variety and number of caterpillars, pollinators, butterflies, bees, and birds. We want to use a wide variety, and that will also ensure that there's something blooming from spring to fall, which is not only good for all the critters and pollinators that need it, but it's pleasing to look at as well. We want to adopt healthy gardening practices. And in doing so, we want to think about natural versus human dominated systems. We want to mimic nature and do what she does. We want to abandon all or nothing thinking. This can be really discouraging. You don't have to be at one end or the other of the spectrum. You don't have to remove every non-native plant you have and turn your whole lawn into a prairie. Though if that's your goal, head toward it. More power to you. We love it. But you want to start with what you can. Remember, what you plant matters. And every single plant makes a difference. So begin to move closer to nature. Begin to add some native plants. And progress at a pace that feels manageable for you as you work to create a healthier ecosystem in your yard. You can always do a little more next year and a little more the year after that. We want to adopt management practices that mimic nature. So leaving the stems standing over winter, leaving fall leaves on the ground. Again, this is not all or nothing, but in recent years, we've come to understand that it's not just about keeping your property looking neat and tidy. These stems and the leaves provide valuable wildlife benefits. So we want to leave at least a portion of them in our landscapes for that purpose. We'll discuss more about this in detail in our later in the series in our management webinar. So I hope you'll stick around for that to find out more about why that's important. We want to reduce or eliminate pesticide use. Remember that holes in leaves are good. It means your plants are doing their job. And pesticides disrupt that food web. Also remember that everything we add to the garden eventually makes its way into our water supply. So we want to preferably eliminate the products, the pesticides and the fertilizers and things that we're using in our yards so that they don't end up in our water. Finally, we need to be patient and remember that native perennials may take some time to establish. Some may take a couple of years to begin blooming. And this may be a shift if you're used to buying non-native annuals at the hardware store and replacing them every year or every season. The wait is worth it. Okay, very quickly to close out our session today, some things you can do if you rent, even if you don't have control of what is planted on the property. So if you're responsible for the mowing, you can mow less frequently and just tolerate the grass being a little bit longer. It doesn't need to be an every weekend thing. And this will decrease the air and noise pollution levels in your neighborhood. You can set the mower blades a little bit higher as you're doing so, and that allows the grass to be a little bit taller and helps it outcompete weeds. Maybe you don't have as much need, or your landlord doesn't feel as much need to come and spray for things. Same thing if you're responsible for leaf removal, you may be able to leave all or some of the fallen leaves over the winter to help support habitat for the critters who rely on them. If landscaping is being replaced, request native plants. Maybe give your landlord or your property management staff the link to this webinar series. If you have a balcony or a deck, you can research native plants that grow well in containers. Every single native plant helps, even if you only have room for a few. I have some resources along with this program to help you find those plants that will do well in containers as well. And finally, continue to learn more about native plants and their benefits, and apply it when and where you can. You can talk to friends and family members about how to create healthy ecosystems in their yards as well. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you'd like to learn more, I recommend that you check out both the resources that accompany this webinar and the other great information at Mid-America Regional Council and Deep Roots websites at mark.org and deeproots.org respectively. Consider attending the Planet Native Conference. This is an annual conference with lots of great information, excellent expert speakers from all over the country who will help you learn more about native plants and more about how to support healthy ecosystems in your spaces. If you have questions, you can contact Deep Roots or Mid-America Regional Council with the information on your screen. Thank you so much for being here. We hope you'll join us next time as we dig up the dirt on healthy soil systems.